Today I'm going to be going through all 32 main Elden Ring bosses and deciding whether I think they're overrated, underrated, or properly rated. Just call me the Dark Souls Gary V. Let me know if you want a video on Dark Souls, Bloodborne, or Sekiro, because these are really fun for me and I'm sure I'm about to make a ton of people mad, so let's go. First up, we got Maliketh. Oh great, I'm going to piss people off already. Maliketh is a great boss, but his attacks were kind of all over the place and annoying for me, so I don't think he's as good as a lot of people say. I don't love the first phase as a whole either, but I will admit the reveal during the second phase was pretty awesome and unexpected. I also don't pay attention to the lore, so maybe that was just me. That being said, he's still a great boss and has a really cool design, but I think he's a tad bit overrated just because he wasn't all that fun to fight for me. Oh, also, you should cop a shirt from the link in the pinned comment. My friend and I worked super hard on hand making these and they are awesome, so you should definitely go do that, please. I love you, thank you. Next up, we have the Godskin Duo. Man, I'm almost tempted to say they're a teeny bit underrated because I like both of these bosses individually, but not really together. I guess I'll go properly rated. I think people's reaction toward them was pretty justified. It's just a lazy boss, and it's even worse that it's required to progress the story. I think if this boss was optional, I'd say otherwise, but it's still a reskin gank in the end, so let me not go too crazy. Let's move on to Rykard. Ooh, this one's actually tough. For what it's worth, I think this is the best gimmick boss FromSoft has ever done, and is a rare instance where they balance the gimmick with the challenge pretty well. He also had a pretty amazing reveal and gets bonus points for being kind of hidden somewhere I didn't expect. I don't want to say underrated because I think a lot of people love Rykard, but you know what, let me give him his flowers right now. Underrated, he deserves it. Alright, next we got the Red Wolf of Radagon. This one is hard because all I can think of is that stupid reskin they did of this boss along with the Crucible Knight, which was just super weird and unfitting, but I actually kind of like this boss. He was kind of annoying and it felt like they were trying to make a more modernized version of Sif, but it just didn't quite hit. I remember having a bit of trouble with this boss just because his attacks are so frantic, but I don't think I can justify an underrated here just because he was kind of fun. The boss was pretty mid overall for a main boss, so I'm gonna go with properly rated. Moving on, we have Commander O'Neill. I hated this boss. He would have been so good without the summons. Why did they have to add that? No boss is better when it summons in other enemies during the fight. That being said, he wasn't as hard for me as everyone else made him seem, but I still thought he was a bad boss. I'm pretty sure most people hate this guy as well, so I'm gonna go with properly rated here since I don't see anyone claiming that he's actually good. Let's do Commander Niall while we're at it too. While his summons aren't as obnoxious as his counterpart, he is way harder than Commander O'Neill due to his massive damage output and combos. This is one of those bosses that made me bang my head against the wall over and over trying to beat him, and I did not have very much fun doing so. His two summons at the beginning are such a pain to take out every time you go to fight him again, and it just feels like an extra step for the sake of adding variety. Overall, I'm gonna give him an overrated because I remember everyone hyping him up when the game came out, saying he was the craziest boss ever, and the fight itself kind of disappointed me, even though I still thought he was pretty cool. Next up, we have Rennala. Off the bat, I'm gonna say overrated. I'm sorry, I know a lot of people like her, and I think the boss arena and everything is cool, but the first phase is a glorified Deacons of the Deep, and the second phase, she becomes a glorified punching bag. I think if she was more difficult, she would have been way more fun, but I understand the fight for what it is and can still appreciate it. But still, the only thing that gives her any challenge is her summoning, and even that is pretty weak. Top 3 boss arena though, absolutely gorgeous setting. Moving on though, we have the Regal Ancestor Spirit. I actually think this boss was super overhated, and I get that it was a bit too easy, but this is one of the most creative fights FromSoft has ever done, and I thought it was super interesting. I think a lot of the hate came from people hyping it up after seeing it in the trailer, and while I will admit it was a bit disappointing, I still think this boss is underrated because it felt like a refreshing change of pace and the aesthetic was on point. But yeah, it was pretty easy. Next up, we have Lichdragon Fortissax, a secret boss fight that I actually didn't even know about until my second playthrough. This boss is so badass, and while I do think there's another dragon that did it a bit better, Lichdragon Fortissax is pretty much a perfect fight for what it is. We really got spoiled with the dragon fights in this game. The Souls series had a few misses, Dark Souls 2, with dragon fights, but the dragons in Elden Ring were done really well. My only gripe is that you can't use Torrent like with some of the other dragon bosses, but I still think they pulled it off and it wasn't as bad as the Elden Beast. Properly rated. And speaking of the Elden Beast, let's talk about this disaster. I'm ranking this separately from Radagon because I think it's absolutely criminal that they put these two bosses together. Radagon would have been a top 10 FromSoft boss if he wasn't paired with the Elden Beast, but we'll get to him in a second. The Elden Beast is such a cool boss, and it truly hurts my heart because this had the potential to be one of the most incredible bosses in the series, if we had Torrent. This thing swims away if you do so much as brush its shoulder and really just has some attacks that feel completely unreasonable. Like the rings, man, I get it. It's called Elden Ring, but you have to run so far to get away from this attack, and it's just not enjoyable whatsoever. It feels like everyone already hates on this boss enough, and while I don't think it's terrible, there are still too many defenders for me to give it anything less than overrated. And while we're at it, let's go to Radagon. Incredible boss. Probably would have been top 3, if not number 1 in Elden Ring for me, if it wasn't attached to a boss that fights in a completely different way. Radagon felt much more like the grand final boss we were waiting for in this game, and had a Soul of Cinder-esque feeling to him, being the dramatic and fitting conclusion to the game. He actually felt damn near impossible to me in my first playthrough, and that's kind of the thing I love in these games. Give me a boss that's so difficult I have to fight him a ton of times to learn the moveset. I will say his ground stomp move felt a little bit broken at times, but I think being able to get a visceral on him balanced that out enough to justify it. Also, I already talked about this on my Twitter. Go follow me and get angry at my hot takes on the Soulsborne series, and join the Discord if you want to chat with me. Link in the description. Damn, I'm just full of plugs today, aren't I? Anyway, let's move on to Elemer of the Briar. Absolutely 100% underrated. Honestly, one of my favorite bosses in the game, and I totally forget he even exists because he was so easy. He's nice and simplistic, but the unique element of his sword being able to extend past his own reach is so cool, and I wish they had made this fight more of a spectacle. Probably the most underrated boss in the game, if not the series, I don't care. Next up, we have Margit, another one of my favorite bosses and a great first main boss for this game. I remember being surprised at how long it took for the first real boss to show up in this game, and Margit definitely did not disappoint. He was the first boss I felt like introduced us to the crazy delayed moves that most of the main bosses in this game have, and I still struggle with him if I go there a little bit too early. Probably the most impressive early game boss in the series, and I don't think he gets enough props, so I'm gonna go underrated. Let's move on to the dragons, not the main ones, just the mini bosses. This one's kind of tough because obviously there are a ton of different dragons in this game, and they all have different elements, but they're not different enough for me to rate separately. I think these are all pretty solid bosses, and it's fun to use Torrent against them, but after running into the 10th dragon mini boss in a row, it got kind of annoying. I think they get bonus points for being optional as well as showing up in cool open locations, but there's nothing super memorable about any of these dragons aside from the first one. I guess I'll say they're properly rated, but they'd probably be a bit underrated if there weren't so many of them. Next up, we got Godfrey, the Golden Shade version. This guy was pretty disappointing to me, to be honest. He wasn't that difficult, and after hearing about what a legend Godfrey was the entire game, I prepared for an awesome fight that I just didn't quite receive. Obviously, the real Godfrey fight is much different, but this one was just kind of mid due to him using the same 3 moves over and over. I do appreciate the simplicity of it, and I do think it's a pretty enjoyable fight overall, but I gotta go with overrated for the Golden Shade. Moving on, oh boy, we got the Fire Giant. I actually didn't hate the Fire Giant as much as everyone else in my first playthrough, but I will admit that his design wasn't the best. I think the first time I saw him, it was just so unexpected, especially with how wide the arena was, but it was more of a spectacle than anything. The Fire Giant objectively has poor design, so I can't give him much credit, but I try to take these bosses as they are from a first playthrough's perspective, because I think part of the appeal to some of these is just the reveal, so I'll go properly rated here. Next up, we have Mohg, Lord of Blood. I know a lot of people came around to him after a while and realized he had been slept on, but I still think he's a bit underrated. Mohg was a boss I totally was not expecting, and the fight itself really impressed me. His Blood Ring move had me panicking the first time since I had no idea what was happening, and I think his character is just really cool overall. He kind of came out of nowhere, and I specifically remember thinking he was one of my favorite bosses as soon as I started fighting him. Also, subscribe if you want to see me do a video on the Bloodborne bosses next. But let's move on. Next, we got Loretta, Knight of the Haligtree. This is another one that felt like it was only fair for us to be able to use Torrent, but I actually liked this fight. I know a lot of people were disappointed by it, but I thought dodging all the magic was fun, and since she's riding a horse, she has a pretty massive hitbox, making Ashes of War super satisfying to use. I think I'm actually going to go underrated here, even though she was way too easy. I'm noticing a pattern here that I find a lot of the easier bosses underrated, but I think it's because people write bosses off because they're too easy instead of how good they actually are. Or maybe I just need to get good. Anyway, let's move on to Leonine Misbegotten. This one was super disappointing for me because I was expecting something much more intense for this fight. He has a similar moveset to Gale as well, and it's a shame he was so incredibly easy. His boss arena was awesome as well and had a super dramatic run up to him, so I couldn't help but feel sad after killing him in like 3 hits. He's another one of those bosses that fell to Elden Ring's biggest flaw in my opinion, which is the level imbalance. To be fair, I probably reached him much later in the game than intended, but it is an open world game and I chose my path how I wanted to. I'm gonna go with overrated, even though I think a lot of people felt the same, but the fact that it felt overhyped when I fought him for the first time is what solidifies this in my eyes. Next up, we have the Twin Gargoyles, probably the worst boss on this entire list, so I'm gonna go with overrated. Or maybe properly rated, I don't know, no one seems to like this boss anyway. The gargoyles are already one of the most heinous enemies to fight in this game, and the fact that there's an actual gank boss for them is ridiculous. For some reason, I still kind of appreciate that they do these kind of fights though. It's almost like a joke from the developers to the player, but the boss is still trash, so I'm not rating it any higher. Anything that flies in this game is just horrible. Anyway, let's move on to Godrick, probably my favorite boss in the entire game. Godrick is so unbelievably underrated, it shocks me at how little credit he gets. First of all, he's an early game boss that easily could have been an end game boss and still would have held up, provided he has more health. But I think that's the reason a lot of people count him out. They say he's too easy. I don't know how high of a level you all were when you first encountered him, but I was pretty low, so he took me a while. I will admit that he's a bit too easy for the level you're supposed to be, but his moveset is way more complex than any other early game boss in the series, and he's just so much fun to fight. Not to mention, he has an incredible second phase. He also includes attacks that teach you the importance of the jump mechanic, so he really just has it all in my opinion. Underrated. Next up, let's go to Magma Wyrm Makar, another boss that I thought was pretty unique, but also pretty unenjoyable. I like the concept of having a boss that fights sorta like a mini dragon, but the lava spewing everywhere and staying was super annoying. It also moves rapidly around the arena while doing so, making it pretty difficult to get out of the way. I don't necessarily hate this boss, but I think I'm gonna go with overrated. Moving on, we have the Godskin Apostle. I think there are two of these fights in the game, and I actually love this boss on its own. Its moveset is super unique, and it's a shame that its reputation was tarnished, no pun intended, by the Godskin Duo. The magic, the super stretchy limbs, everything about this fight is as awesome as it is creepy, and I honestly think it's one of the best mini bosses in Elden Ring. Super underrated. And while we're here, we might as well talk about its counterpart, the Godskin Noble. While I don't think this fight is as good as the Godskin Apostle, I really enjoyed this one too. Its speed was pretty shocking to me at first, and definitely has some attacks that drive me nuts, but it still has its own identity separate from the Apostle with its crazy second phase. I think this one is pretty underrated too, because I would have had much fonder memories with this boss if it hadn't been for the duo. Moving on to probably the stupidest fight in this game, we have Fia's Champions. Basically, it's the gank squad, but infinitely easier, and you won't be rethinking all of your life choices after dying. In fact, if you died at all to this boss, I don't know why you're still watching this, because I guarantee you didn't make it to any of these other bosses. It's tough for me to say what this fight could have done differently besides scrapping the whole thing, but maybe if they came in one at a time like the beginning of the fight, but with more health, it would have been a little bit cooler. But if the triple gank was any harder, they would have outshined the Godskin Duo. Properly rated. Next up, we have Godfrey, the real Godfrey. This is the kind of fight I'd been looking forward to for the entire game, and it did not disappoint. My only real complaint is that the Horaloo phase felt like it should have been first, but it was still a really cool reveal and just a crazy fight overall. I think this fight is perfectly balanced and is one of the bosses I look forward to the most when playing through this game again. Properly rated. Moving on, we have Ancient Dragon Lansseax, kind of a Placidusax clone, but a little bit easier. I think he's a tad bit overrated due to the hype he got. I still think he's one of the best dragon bosses in the series, but he wasn't different enough for me to feel anything significant about him. The area you fight him in was also kind of annoying, which may be what rubbed me the wrong way. And speaking of dragons, let's talk about Dragonlord Placidusax, probably one of my favorite dragon bosses in the series and objectively one of the most well designed. Easily one of the coolest bosses and boss arenas in the game, and everything about it is just epic. It's also one of the most fun dragon fights since most of them consist of the dragon flying away from you the entire fight. Placidusax doesn't do it in the same way. The red lightning attacks are awesome to top it off, and the aesthetic of this fight is just unmatched. Properly rated. Moving on, we have Sir Gideon Ofnir next. I actually thought this fight was pretty fun because I always appreciate an NPC 1v1, but it was just way too easy for how far it was in the game. His magic spam is insane though, and I wish they had given him some decent melee attacks to even it out, because if you get him up close, he's insanely easy. I think his variety of spells makes it a fun fight though, and while he can heal himself during the fight, his health bar is just too pitiful to make much of a difference. That being said, I think he's kind of underrated because even though the fight was over in 10 seconds, he could be a fun fight if you aren't as high of a level. Next up, we have a more interesting fight, Astel. This fight was hyped up so much upon Elden Ring's release, as well as a good amount of time leading up to him from the trailer. Astel gets a 10 for aesthetic, but I didn't really think the fight was all that great. He wasn't as difficult as everyone said, and aside from being blown away by the visuals, I didn't get much from the fight. All the attacks felt like explosions or big slams, which got kind of repetitive to me. I still think this is a really cool boss fight, but I'm definitely gonna say this one's overrated. Moving on to our last 5, we have Dragonkin Soldier of Nokstella, a pretty cool boss with a really cool boss arena. I think this one got kind of slept on. I mean, it had a whole second phase. What really made it suck for me was its health. Once again, I barely even saw the second phase of my first playthrough because I killed it so quickly. None of its attacks were that crazy until halfway through, but the lightning moves were so cool to me and were such a surprise for a random mini boss. The fight wasn't anything that insane, but I'm still gonna say it's underrated because I never really hear it mentioned. Next up, we have Morgott, another one of my favorite bosses in this game, though not as good as Godfrey. This fight is the definition of delayed attack bait, and it really messed me up. But it's basically just Margit on steroids, which I'm definitely not mad at, and I think it's one of the most enjoyable fights in the game overall. Great challenge, great moveset and variety, and a ton of fun. Morgott is underrated for me because I think he got outshined by Godfrey, but is still in my top 5. By the way, these bosses are in complete random order. But moving on to our last 3, let's go to one of my favorite ideas for a boss in the series, the Mimic tier. I know it got a lot of hate for how easy it was, but I'm giving points strictly for creativity. Finding out that you could go into the fight without anything equipped and then re-equip everything after was hilarious to me, and I think it would have been even funnier if FromSoft made it one-shot you with its fists or something crazy for people who tried that. I really wish they had made the fight more even because I think it's such a fun idea, but it's just too easy with its lack of health, and on top of that, you know your exact build, so you know all of its strengths and weaknesses. Still, I'm gonna say it's underrated. 2 bosses left here. Let's move on to the one that's gonna make everyone angry, Radon. This boss absolutely blew my mind the first time I fought him, and I think they did a great job incorporating the lore. But the fight itself is mid. Maybe I should just fight him one-on-one, but I didn't have much fun fighting him with or without summons. This boss felt more like a grand spectacle for a first playthrough rather than a boss that's supposed to be enjoyable on subsequent playthroughs. I know he's most people's favorite boss in the game, which is why I gotta say he's overrated. But at least they let you use Torrent here. And last but not least, we have Malenia. This is tough because this was by far the most hyped up boss in the game, and I remember being terrified to fight her in the beginning. But I had so much fun with this one, and I love how they pushed the boundaries of difficulty by giving her the lifesteal mechanic. Both phases are ridiculously hard, and without using a summon, she's without a doubt the hardest boss in the series. She loses points for the waterfowl dance move, but I still think she's a good boss. I just hope they have more bosses like her in the DLC. Properly rated. And since I did all this work rating every single boss, I figured I should finally do an outro. So I